that they will be impacted upon by a no-deal Brexit scenario with no transition period, but have not yet started to plan. And that figure's 52% for London, smaller businesses. So our priority right now is to get, is to really push both the government and the EU for the benefit of smaller businesses on both sides to get a deal to avoid this cliff edge scenario.
Thank you. And Tim?
Well, I represent food and drink manufacturing, which is Britain's largest manufacturing sector, so my members are Williams customers. And I would echo a number of the points he made. I think I would draw attention to the particular nature of food and drink, typically perishable, short shelf lives. So the just-in-time supply chains that William referred to are very fragile. And any disruption to those, I think, will very quickly be felt at the retail end of the spectrum. We eat, of all the food we eat in this country, around a half comes from outside the UK, is not domestically produced. And 78% of the food we export goes to the EU. So the movement of food, and in particular what I would describe as the final mile of how we get food into the shops, how we get it to the restaurant and hotel and catering trade, how we get it to schools, hospitals and prisons, is the thing that probably concerns us most at the moment, because for the reasons William described, we are expecting there to be an increase in friction in the event of no deal. And that will very quickly snowball into potentially some quite serious disruption, we think.
And in fact, you've described, I think, the government's technical notice they've published as that particularly frightening for small, medium-sized enterprises. Is that correct in the sense of the guidance been given at this moment in time?
Well, Sonali is exactly right, and we find very much the same among our members. And of course, the majority of food and drink manufacturers are small, medium and micro-sized businesses. That those who have the resources for contingency planning are able to do that and are doing that. But for anything from kind of small, medium down, people just don't have the resources to do this, and they're hoping that someone else will find an answer to this.
We've heard evidence around that why it's not so straightforward as people saying, oh, you should stockpile and do that. Is that? Can you just elaborate a little bit further of why your particular sector of the industry, why we don't stockpile anymore? I think we sort of understand it, but it'd be useful for our evidence as well to see it from your point of view.
Well, there are some practical considerations. Of course, fresh food cannot be stockpiled. It has a shelf life. It's perishable. The industry has built itself around seamless movement of trade, and one of the things that Brexit has revealed is the complexity of food and drink supply chains. So raw materials, ingredients, part finished goods, crossing borders, typically very often before the final product gets to market. And so a lot of businesses, in order to be more efficient, and food prices generally have fallen for a long time now, with a spike since the referendum back upwards, but typically food prices were falling, and that reflects efficiencies in the supply chain, like the fact that people have been taking out warehousing because they can move product much more quickly in a just-in-time way and get it to customers just at the moment they need it. So the idea that you can put that all into reverse and start finding extra warehousing space, particularly refrigerated warehousing, that you can find the lorries to move stock to stockpile. And of course, there are knock-on effects of starting to do that. Some of our members are starting to move ingredients and raw materials either into the UK or to continental Europe in order to provide them with some contingency. But the balance of opinion among my members is that 2 weeks is about the most you can possibly set aside. And we will start to see some effects of that behaviour, because as people buy ahead, prices will rise, availability will diminish.
And the recent National Audit Office report, are people familiar with that, that said they found that neither government and business, and maybe you can echo this out, have had time to put in place a people, systems, infrastructure to ensure an effective trading operations in the event of no deal. Is that something that comes through more and more about from the people that you're dealing with? Do you want to go first, William?
I think, Mr. Duval, you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, what that report sums up is the range of border controls that would have to be met to get goods in and out of the country. It's not just about customs. It's not just about checking that the right tariff's been paid, the rules of origin. It's also about things like the Common Transit Convention. And we found in the NEO report that the infrastructure simply isn't there to be able to guarantee that that could operate if the UK were an independent member of the Common Transit Convention for next year. We produced a customs roadmap last summer which set out the whole range of sort of border checks and border controls, things like safety permits, security permits for goods, checks for VAT and excise on goods as well, if they were vatable items. So I think you can see that moving from frictionless trade to a system that's going to involve huge hurdles and huge problems to get over is going to impact on the quality of goods, the supply of goods, and the price of goods. And I think our other concern is if we do get no deal and there was to be a further depreciation in the value of sterling, that would also drive up the price of imports. As Tim said, a great amount of food is imported. Our members tell us of the food that they import, 79% of that comes from the European Union. And if you have sort of prices of imports going up, the consumer is going to pay more.
And is that borne out by work that your organisation has done?
Yes, I mean, I think from the smaller business FSB perspective, and of course we're cross-sectorial, we would be particularly concerned about the impact on those of our members that currently exclusively export to the EU and therefore in all likelihood have not had any experience of completing customs declarations or indeed of rules of origin. So in the event of a no-deal scenario, if EU and UK content had to be treated as distinct, we would have concerns about their ability to be able to do that and to be able to select the correct preferences. So, you know, that clearly that's a significant concern for us. Also, more broadly, when we've surveyed our members, of those that are currently exporting to the EU right now, approximately 59% say that their decision to export would be materially impacted if they or their intermediaries needed to complete customs declarations. So that's an important part of the picture. It's also about the capacity of intermediaries, freight forwarders, custom brokers, to potentially be able to deal with an upsurge in the smaller businesses in particular that might need to utilise their services, and whether that capacity really exists and whether it can be scaled up in time in a certain eventuality.
And Tim, anything to add?
I think my colleagues have really covered it all there. These are the practical issues that food and drink manufacturers are trying to wrestle with at the moment. Authorised economic operator status is something the government has referred to as something that may form the basis of a future way of making trade more frictionless. But our members say to us that although once you've submitted the application you might get a response within 4 months, to get the information necessary to fill out the form to apply for AEO status might take a business a year. So if you haven't applied for it by now, you're probably not going to get it.
Right, let's move on then to Assembly Member Pidgeon.
Thank you very much. What advice have you received from the government about what your industry, what the people you represent should do to prepare for a no-deal Brexit? And is there anything missing from that advice and information from government?
So we've had relatively good engagement so far with a range of government departments, DEFRA, Treasury, DFT, covering the range of issues from SPS rules to haulage to VAT. We've also been consulted by the government's border delivery group as well, which has been effective in terms of them having a good understanding of what our food supply chains are like. In terms of the technical notices, they were pretty much declaratory. They didn't tell us much that we didn't know before. We were able, through our campaigning, to get a tweak to the government's position on VAT if there was a no-deal Brexit. So they took the BRC's advice and have decided to have a deferred accounting system for VAT. That at least would prevent importers having to pay up at the border before being able to bring their goods into the UK. But there's still a lot we don't know, frankly. We don't know the slightest bit about what's going to happen in relation to the Irish border. That was a common factor around all 80 plus of those technical notices. We don't know, of course, what tariffs are going to be applicable from the 30th of March next year. And of course, if we have MFN tariffs that come in, that's going to impose a great cost pressure on food retailers in particular.
Okay, so there's been engagement, but there's just such a void in terms of actual clarity on what's going to happen.
Indeed. And yeah.
Sonali.
So we have, again, echoing William's points, had good engagement. We called for the publication of advice from government to support smaller businesses. So we did welcome the publication of the technical notices. But by definition, they are incredibly technical, complex, difficult to penetrate. We welcome the recent publication, I think, by HMRC of a partnership pack that tries to simplify some of the technical notices in key areas such as customs, which we think will be particularly useful to our members. I guess the trick of the tricky issue right now is our advice to smaller businesses is start to plan, start to think about what you need to do in terms of contingency. But we are still waiting for the government, if and when this point comes where actually smaller businesses start to need to actually spend actual money on, engaging with consultants or buying certain types of software or establishing relationships with intermediaries. And at that point, I think we'll be looking for something more tangible in terms of financial incentives to support those additional costs that smaller businesses will need to occur if that particular eventuality were to occur. I think it's important to say that this is not just about government putting advice out. We have also produced our own small business Brexit hub where we try to sort of summarise the key aspects of technical notices and wrap that around sort of a bit more of a narrative of what's actually occurring right now, whether that's in relation to the backstop, potential end state scenarios, to sort of help to educate and inform smaller businesses about what is really going on Brexit.
So you're trying to explain in sort of plain English to your members,
yes,
this is what's going on, and start preparing.
To try to categorise the information in a way that they can help them to process and understand it.
Yeah, very good. Tim?
I think William's right that the technical notices answered some questions but left many others unanswered. So if I take one specific example relating to organic food producers who export to the EU, technical notice confirmed that they will no longer be able to use the EU certification mark for organic, and that they will have to wait until we become a third country in order for the UK then to apply to have its new organic certification mark recognised by the EU, and that process typically takes 6 months. Now that's obviously a terrible prospect for organic food exporters, being locked out of their markets for 6 months. For many of them, they wouldn't survive that. Now, DEFRA's response to that is we are seeking ways to minimise that 6 month period. But that is not a sufficient level of detail for a business to be able to know what its future is. So that, I think, is probably the case around the technical notices. William raises an important point that we probably didn't cover enough about the fears of the immediate impact of no deal, which is around cash flow. So a lot of these impacts, whether it's about having to pay tariffs or whether it's about contracts being broken by force majeure, insurance consequences, legal consequences, for small and medium-sized businesses, these could be very material to their trading. And we don't yet know whether the government is going to stand behind some of that, to help support some of that, is going to encourage the banks to provide more support to small businesses in that sort of scenario. So again, a whole series of potentially very worrying questions for smaller food and drink manufacturers, I think. Michael Gove, in front of the House of Lords Environment Committee, has talked about this idea that at some point quite soon the government might declare no deal as now the most likely option. And I think that, certainly for my members, fills us with a great sense of fear and trepidation that becomes the trigger point for many more businesses to start actively instigating contingency plans and all the knock-on effects I talked about earlier.
And have you been giving specific advice to your members?
We've been giving, I would say, general advice. So we've talked, some of this is about things as simple as reviewing your supply routes into and out of the country, since we know the short sea crossings are the ones that are likely to be most impacted. We've talked about ensuring that they do their due diligence up and down their supply chain. So satisfying yourself that your own business knows what it's going to do isn't enough. You've got to know that your suppliers have done the same, and your customers are also ready for the impact. So it tends to be things at that kind of level. We're not really set up to provide individual level advice to members, but we are doing our best and increasingly now focusing on practical things that they need to be doing that can help them to mitigate impact.
And what products do you think are most at risk from possible supply chain disruption? You've talked about also the organic, which I hadn't considered before. I mean, that's a huge issue.
Yeah. I would think the things with the shortest shelf life, so that, fresh produce that may have a shelf life of only 3, 4, 5 days, clearly that's going to be most impacted by friction. A lot of William will know more about this than I do, but a lot of the supermarkets will have contracts of supply with their suppliers to guarantee a shelf life when it arrives into their warehouse. Now, if your journey is disrupted on the way to the warehouse, then you're potentially in trouble. Not least, not only the knock-on effects on retail, but also the commercial relationships between supplier and retailer.
And are you, I'll come to William in a sec, are you actively considering stockpiling some produce, some materials?
Some of our members are already moving, as I say, raw materials, packaging materials. People forget that, you've got to be able to put the food into something before you can sell it typically. So most of our packaging materials that we use in this country is imported, actually from the EU. So people are already doing that. That's started to happen where they can. They're trying to move things either to continental Europe or to the UK in order to mitigate some of the impacts and to try and provide a bit of a buffer. But somebody was telling me, one of our members was telling me that although one of the products they sell, a confectionery product, has a shelf life of a year, some of the ingredients that go to make it have much shorter shelf lives. And it's only when they're combined into the finished product that you get the 1 year shelf life. So, there are complexities upon complexities in this.
Yes, I'd read somewhere that Cadbury's are stockpiling ingredients for chocolate. Well, that filled me with huge horror. Maybe that, quite frankly, should have been used in the campaign and we wouldn't be in this position. William, do you want to comment on that, about stockpiling, but also the supply chain risk for your members?
For sure. Thank you, Caroline. It's simply not practical for our members to stockpile food. Some of our larger retailers have around 2 to 3 days supply of commodities like tomatoes. The warehousing space isn't there, the chilled warehousing isn't there. And I think even in terms of non-food retailers, there is the cash flow element to this. That if you buy up a lot of stock now, and it emerges that we do get a deal, then how can you disperse that stock efficiently? So businesses are having to look at whether it's prudent to hedge against certain outcomes. For food, it's simply not a practical solution to stockpile. I think that's the very clear answer that we've had. One of the things that's been very interesting, speaking to our food members in particular, is the degree of knowledge that they have, even down to particular product and month level, about where produce is coming from. So, products like sort of apples and oranges and avocados, they're aware where are the pinch points in particular parts of the year in terms of ensuring supply. So it's been very instructive in that respect. But it's simply not possible to replace products which are imported from the European Union, which come in through very efficient supply chains from products elsewhere. That's been the clear message, particularly from food retailers.
And I think you acknowledged earlier that you think prices are going to go up if there's a no deal.
One of the things that we've established through our data analytics team is the impact that reverting to MFN tariffs would have on prices that consumers face. So if you look at the current tariffs, for beef it's around the low 40s, for cheddar it's around the mid 40s, for tomatoes around the high 20s. And we've established that you could be facing estimated increases of between 5 and 29% on beef. And we take a lot of beef coming in from the Republic of Ireland. Depending on what happens to sterling, depending on what happens to commodity prices, cheddar estimated increases of between 6 and 32%, tomatoes between 9 and 18%, and broccoli between 5 and 10%. If we have a no-deal scenario with MFN tariffs, There's simply no way that retailers will be able to defray the costs of these extra tariffs. So consumers will have to pay more.
So it's a huge concern. Huge concerns. Anyone got anything else to add on that?
Cheese is a very interesting example. It's one of our most successful food and drink exports. I think it's our third biggest by value after Scotch whisky and smoked salmon.
No, really?
Yeah. And if you think about it, so you've got the impact at Williams' end of the supply chain in retail. So, but that cheese, cheddar cheese, is made in big factories around the country. There's a big one in Northern Ireland. There's a big one in North Wales. So you've got an impact on my members, the food and drink manufacturers. Suddenly, your market for export has disappeared. And then you've got an impact at the farmers level, because the dairy farmers are producing the cheese that's making the milk that's making the cheddar. So these impacts, have reverberations right across the supply chain.
And was there anything reassuring, perhaps Sonali, you might ask this, reassuring at all from the government yesterday in the budget?
Yeah, I mean, the budget we felt was small business friendly. It's a recognition that the costs of doing business right now are impacting on smaller businesses, and that is exacerbated by the inevitable uncertainty that Brexit is creating within the small business community. So our latest small business index, where we track small business confidence, has shown for Q3 that for only the third time since the beginning of 2013, small business confidence is in negative territory. And actually, if you look at London small businesses, there you're seeing one of the most extreme sort of areas of real lack of confidence per se. So the measures in the budget that we particularly welcomed yesterday were around relief for those smaller businesses with a rateable value of below 51k. They're going to see some benefits, one hopes. In addition, the freezing of the VAT threshold for a further 2 years isn't very much welcomed by us, as VAT is one of the most sort of cumbersome and administratively complex taxes for smaller businesses to get their heads around. We welcomed some good news for the self-employed around the new enterprise allowance being continued. Good news, I think, also in terms of sort of infrastructure and skills, potholes, a real sort of scourge for many of our smaller businesses, particularly those in rural areas. There was, overall as a package, it was a well-received budget. But just to go back to
against the backdrop of Brexit.
Against the backdrop of Brexit and this sort of,
challenges.
decline into negative confidence that we've seen amongst the wider small business community, that I think it's fair to say that there's been a lag effect. Our small businesses were confident in the first 2 quarters of the year, but as the uncertainty has continued, you can see that almost being pushed down as smaller businesses and supply chains now are beginning to see some of the consequences perhaps of investment decisions being paused or being halted altogether. So it was really important that there was a boost to small business confidence, and the budget went a large way to achieving that yesterday.
Okay, thank you.
Assembly Member Russell.
Yes, we've actually covered quite a lot of the ground, don't worry, it doesn't matter. but so I'm wanting to focus in on small business, and in particular, what advice and support the government is giving to small business about how to navigate any technical advice that's coming out. So just, do you think there is enough information for small businesses to be able to deal with the type of information or lack of information that they're getting from the government?
So in terms of the technical notices that have already come out, we really welcome the sort of the partnership pack that's been produced sort of around customs and related issues by HMRC, and we would like to see that approach taken for other sort of groups of technical notices. Of course, it's not, there are a wide plethora of issues that they cover, everything from the exchange of personal data, which is incredibly important to many of our smaller businesses, particularly those that are exporting services. There's a lot of stuff there on non-tariff barriers, which is really tricky for our small businesses to get their heads around.
Sorry, which barriers?
Non-tariff barriers,
okay.
Which are just as important as tariff barriers, and will be exacerbated, it's fair to say, in the event of a no-deal scenario. So anything that sort of simplifies and lets small businesses know what they need to do when. So at the moment, the government, I don't think, is asking for all smaller businesses that don't already have one to go out and get an EORI number, an economic operator registration identifier number yet. But if the eventuality occurs that that advice changes, to actually know you now start to actually need to take action, then we need a much sort of clearer flow chart of what smaller businesses need to do, when they need to do it, and who they need to go to. And as I did say at that point, I think FSB, if it were to materialise that set of circumstances, would be calling for some financial support for small businesses, because they're going to have to take on these additional, potentially take on these additional preparations alongside their day-to-day business, and they simply don't have the same resources, wherewithal or capacity, capability to do that as a larger business would.
What about those sort of micro businesses like small convenience stores who are kind of, maybe it's just a couple of people or even a sole trader who's buying possibly food from the EU wholesale and then selling it retail here in London. What kind of advice and support are they getting? Because it seems, there you're talking about people who maybe don't even have English as a first language, potentially, and yet at the moment they're able to manage their business perfectly well. But is there support for those really small businesses that are still going to get caught up in the detail of all of this?
I mean, they're in a really important group for us, and as William says, in the event of a no-deal scenario, one would anticipate a further depreciation in sterling, and the impact of that in terms of the price of imports will be felt very sharply by businesses of the ilk that you describe there. So I do think it's important that those smaller businesses that currently don't think they're going to be directly impacted by Brexit begin to realise that there are going to be very few individuals that would not be affected per se by a no-deal Brexit scenario. And through our Small Business Brexit Pack, we're trying to get that message across, that even if you're not directly or indirectly via supply chain trading with the EU, or you don't directly employ an EU member of staff, there are still going to be a plethora of areas where your business will be impacted upon by a no-deal scenario if it were to materialise.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we've heard about is that across the EU, governments are providing sort of Brexit-ready conventions to help people to prepare, sort of with roadshows and loans to access expert advice and to help sort of prepare to transform supply chains. Do you think that the Mayor should be doing something like this here in London to help Londoners? And I'm thinking both of the kind of the larger businesses, but also those very small micro businesses, which all of it, wherever we live in London, we all have these small corner shops that are, selling us our bread and butter, our onions, and, the can of tomatoes that you can use to make your soup for supper. And could the Mayor be doing something like that, do you think, to help those businesses?
So I think the time is coming now as negotiations sort of head to their sort of crescendo, where direction of travel is going to become clearer. And if it looks as if no deal becomes the most likely possibility in that particular eventuality, then I do think that there is a function for government as a whole to look at what financial support, for example, through a voucher could be provided to smaller businesses that actually need to undertake tangible action to prepare for a scenario that has become more likely. Now, I don't think we're quite yet at that stage, but we're very close to it.
So what do you think, you say we're not quite at that stage, where, it's sort of felt since, June 2016, like the clock has been ticking. Yeah. We've now got about 5 months. I mean, at what point do you think it gets to the point where actually people have just got to act and assume that there's not going to be a deal because actually they don't have enough time otherwise to prepare?
Yeah, I think that point is coming very, very shortly now. Some of our smaller businesses have already started to enact their contingency plans. So they've effectively told us that the consequences of a no deal would be so extreme for them that even if at that point a couple of months ago it looked less likely than it does at the moment, they still made a business decision to prepare, and then any other scenario they could always sort of deliver because they planned for the worst case scenario. And that would apply, I think, to a lot of our businesses that are heavily exposed to trade with the EU, or who very heavily rely upon EU workers as part of their business model. So in a way, a business has to make a decision dependent on their individual circumstances. I think more we were in the space of sort of saying, in terms of our general advice, we don't want smaller businesses to have to rush out and actually spend money on a scenario that may not materialise, but it's such a fluid situation that you can see sort of within the next few weeks almost, where we are looking for that clarity almost from government, when the advice stops being, this is what you need to start to think about or plan for, these are the kind of questions you should be thinking about, to actually, this is what you should now start to do. If you don't, for example, if you don't already have an EORI number, you should start to get one. You should now start to actively try to engage with lawyers on looking at the commercial basis on which you could share personal data or import it from the EU. When does that point sort of think about, when does that shift to actually undertake and actually expend activity? And at that point, you've got a financial exposure. And that's when we would be looking to the government to say, this is the kind of additional support that will be available for smaller businesses. And as you say, micro businesses, sole traders in particular will be exposed, that will need that additional help and support, not just in terms of advice of what to do, but also money to help them do it.
Yep, thank you. Tim, do you want to sort of just talk a bit about the kind of support that the businesses that you represent would want, perhaps from national government, given that you're a national organisation?
Yes, I certainly echo a lot of what Sonali has said. I think the technical notices, of course, were very careful to say that they were not advising businesses actually to take action, merely to advise them what action they might choose to take in the event of no deal. And Sonali's right that has created, in a sense, a bit of ambiguity. People can read that as saying, well, I don't need to do anything yet. I haven't yet been told to do anything. If we get to the stage that Mr. Gove talked about, where the government formally says no deal is now the most likely option, then I think the government needs to be, it's not sufficient for the Chancellor to say, I have 19.5 billion of headroom in the event that we go into a no deal scenario. We need to start knowing where that's going to be spent. The Irish government has been very active in supporting particularly food and drink manufacturers, but other sectors of the economy too. They have, I don't know a great deal about it, but I think they have a voucher scheme, is that right, that supports people who are being impacted by Brexit. So that's one very practical thing that they've already identified. Sonali talks about the costs of contingency planning. One of the things I think needs to, is coming very clearly from today's session is the costs of a no-deal Brexit are already being felt. They're not going to happen on March the 30th. And with each day that passes without a withdrawal agreement, the costs will be going up. And businesses are wondering, am I ever going to get that money back? The government tells me it will sign a deal. I have to make the contingency plans because my audit and risk committee wouldn't countenance the idea that I didn't do my due diligence and plan for that outcome, since that's what the government is telling me to do. So I'm now incurring costs that potentially may be wasted. And I think the government needs to give some clear guidance on that so that businesses can have some reassurance. I talked earlier about cash flow insurance, about the cost of borrowing, those kind of things. So that's important. One of the things that I would think is important for London is to ensure that the Mayor is closely involved in the contingency planning that government departments are doing. All those short sea crossings lead by motorway to London, and you can't get any of those containers to the rest of the country without going at least round London. William will have, I'm sure, a massive concentration of his members in London, and all of those got to be served by lorries of one size or another. So there are some particular challenges, I think, for London in this. And I think government is definitely stepping up its engagement, I would say, in the last 3 weeks. In October, I think we've seen a real step change in government wanting to work with us to start to think some of these contingencies through. But there remains a reticence, which I guess one can understand, on their part to sort of spell out a worst case scenario. But in some ways, that's really what we start to need now, because we have to plan for a worst case scenario, and that's, that's continuing to generate anxiety when you don't know how bad it might be.
William, do you want to add anything?
Thank you, Caroline. Yes, I'd echo Tim's comments. I mean, it's very noticeable that in the Republic of Ireland you have Brexit preparedness, which has been led from the Taoiseach down. And we're seeing these sort of roadshows across Ireland, concerted one-stop shop, government assistance being provided. So, to follow from what Sonali said, one can see the point that if we do get to the time where no deal looks far more likely than there is going to be a deal, we'd be looking for all government agencies and all governments across the UK to be working together to provide that similar one-stop shop service. I think the two biggest issues, I mean, many of our members are already sort of looking at what they can do to limit exposure around increases in tariffs or extra duties, what VAT implications there might be, what the impact on data might be. But it's really about haulage and people that we've got to say are two of the biggest concerns right now. If we fall out without having an agreement with the EU, the number of haulage permits falls to fewer than 1,300 a year. So the availability and price of haulage are dramatically affected by that. That's going to be a huge impediment.
That's for UK haulage
That's
contract.
correct, yeah.
So would EU haulage contractors be able to bring stuff here?
I think our understanding would be potentially, but there would be limits on that as well, because it becomes determined by...
Would they be UK limits or...
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the technical notices, we fall back to the Vienna Convention. So that would create some limits on the number of cross-border haulage trucks which could enter the UK. But in terms of UK permits, it falls to fewer than 1,300. It's a massive concern.
And how many, just to put that in context, how many are there at the moment?
Our understanding is there are around 75,000 hauliers and around 38,000 permits that would exist at the moment. So, we're falling to a mere fraction of the required haulage that would be required to get goods from our members in and out of the UK. And the other issue is people. We have 170,000 EEA nationals who work in the retail sector, many in the logistics and distribution parts of that. In London, some of our members can be employing as many as 1 and 2 people from the rest of the EEA. So we're already seeing gaps not being able to be filled. And if we go into a complete cliff edge Brexit on the 29th of March, we simply don't know where we're going to be able to source that labour from in order to keep the logistics and the distribution networks around London flowing to get goods to parts of the south and east and across the whole of the UK.
So it just seems to be a terrifying lack of knowledge, kind of surrounding everyone. Sorry, Sonali, you wanted to...
I was just going to add that when we surveyed our members in September, we asked them for those that were going to be impacted or felt that they'd be impacted by a no-deal Brexit with no transition period, what intervention would they find the most useful from government? And just over a quarter said some form of voucher would be helpful in supporting their preparations. In addition
voucher
to
for advice or...
Advice, support, costs, I think, generally. Also, though, Popular was a one-stop shop, and it's not just about government advice. Often a smaller business will be likely to go to their accountant, to their lawyer. It's that sort of local ecosystem of advisors that they would turn to first, and how they're going to be tapped in to advice that's available from the public sector and indeed from lobby groups such as ours.
Thank you.
So I get some of the risks and challenges for London, virtually the same nationally, but I think you mentioned, Tim, about the road network. I think you've talked about people and specifically about haulage in terms of that. Are there any, your national organisations, but are there any London-specific issues, apart from those that have already been mentioned, that haven't been mentioned, that we should be looking out for in terms of preparing the plan? Risks and challenges.
Well, I think particularly in terms of infrastructure, because if we're going to have, in terms of no deal, potentially the M20 and the M26, lanes of those sort of becoming effectively trailer parks, that is going to have an impact on flows of vehicles. I think covering a market as big as London is, and ensuring that my members can keep superstores but also convenience stores that they might have sufficiently stocked with fresh produce is going to be a real challenge, because one of the things that perhaps hasn't been completely appreciated is that often trucks will go to specific stores. They're not even going to warehouses. The supply chains are so efficient that the goods are going straight from the back of the truck onto the shelves. And I think in London that would be a particular concern about how we could supply the market that's involved, given the amount of food which is consumed here.
Any other contributions?
Well, I would only say that one of the things that seems reasonably clear is that part of the government's approach to no-deal planning is the decision potentially to waive some of the regulations that might potentially slow down supply chains. Now, of course, every decision to do that has a knock-on effect in some other way. But if you think of London, it has a low emission zone, it has a congestion charge zone. If we're thinking about free movement of vehicles, presumably at some point you might need to consider whether those are things that you would also need to waive. And that, that potentially is as with all these things, there are big consequences for stepping aside from some of those regulations. So I think there are some London-specific challenges. I mean, according to the ONS, there are 1,500 food and drink manufacturers in London, and they'll all be small businesses with the exception of perhaps 5 or 10. So one of the things about our industry is that it is very geographically diverse. We often say, I don't know if it's factually strictly correct, but we often say Westminster is the only constituency that doesn't have a food and drink manufacturer in it.
Just from a wider smaller business perspective, those that are providing services and rely on being able to go to the EU to discharge contracts, basically undertake short-term business travel, sort of how is mobility going to operate in the eventuality of a no-deal scenario, I think would be quite concerning to a lot of our service providing smaller members within the London area.
I know you talk to government, I know you talk to others, but in this particular building and all our sort of the rest of our family, do you think have you been approached or have you made representations about a no deal, and do you think we've got our listening ears on? So we're scrutinising the mayor's strategies, but as the mayor's office, not the mayor's office direct, but are we sufficiently engaged with you to understand some of the challenges that we need to prepare for? Do you feel that's the case? And I know you've got different sized organisations, but is that?
Well, we have a meeting scheduled, I believe, towards the end of next month with our CEO and another colleague with the mayor. So we're delighted to be able to take the sort of needs of retail, I think, right to the heart of the mayor's office. So we're very pleased about that. I think we've had very good engagement with ministers, with other key members of parliament, also the devolved administrations as well. And I think also there are some issues, of course, like trading standards on goods which would be coming from the EU, which of course are a local authority function. So we need to, I think, ensure that we have engagement right down to local government level as well. But I think there is an appreciation about the effects that no deal would have. The OBR laid it out very clearly yesterday, severe short-term disruption to the economy. And in terms of food and purchasing goods, both online and in store, consumers will see the difference in terms of price, availability and quality, and it won't be a difference for the better.
Anyone want to add to that?
We have a separate sort of FSB London office, our sort of sister. I think engagement has been good, but we'd always welcome more of it.
Good.
I mean, I'm very happy with the level of engagement thus far, but I hope what's coming across quite strongly from us today is that there has been a step change very recently in the way in which we're all thinking about this, in the way in which our members are starting to respond to it, and I suspect that's a challenge for you and for all, government at every level in the UK now.
I think, some of the evidence we've heard is where government could be, for all sorts of reasons, we're not here to create fear, but for scenario planning, resilience planning, we need to understand what their assumptions are, and I think we're trying to push on that. But as we have not got time. Time is not on our side, and we need that information. It becomes very clear for us in terms of those managing the planning, resilience planning on our side, that they could do with that information as quickly as possible, and no doubt your members could as well. Okay, let's move on to Caroline Russell.
Yes, just very briefly, really picking up on what Len has been talking about, but specifically the Mayor's Brexit Business Hub. William, the meeting you've got coming up with the Mayor, is that connected to the Mayor's Brexit Business Hub, or is that a separate thing?
I think we'll be discussing the hub alongside the other particular issues for London. As we discussed, people is particularly pressing for retailers in this city. I talked previously about the logistics and distribution elements, but we have members who are involved in supplying services. We have many of the big coffee chains that we're pleased to have within our membership, and they're finding it hard to fill the vacancies now because it's partly because of the uncertainty about whether EEA nationals would have to prove the right to work in the UK, and also the issue about the depreciation of sterling in the last couple of years. It's much more difficult to fill those vacancies from the EEA. So I think those are the key issues, along with supply chains, that we'll be hopefully discussing with the Mayor.
Okay, and Sonali, have you had any contact with the Mayor about his Brexit hub?
We have, through a meeting we were at. Actually, it was crime focused, but it also had an important discussion on Brexit. But again, that's an area where we would really welcome ongoing engagement. We have our own hubs. The Mayor has a hub. How do we get as much coordination between all of those bodies that are trying to provide help, information, advice and support, so that smaller businesses know the best place that they can go to? That can only be of benefit.
Yep, so coordination, collaboration. And Tim,
I'm not aware that we have had any direct contact with the Mayor on that issue, although I suspect it's one that he might well have gone direct to food and drink companies rather than to us.
Sure. Is that something,
We'd certainly welcome it, yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much.
Caroline Pigeon.
Yeah, so should this no-deal scenario persist, thinking longer term, what are the implications for your sectors? William?
I think one of the biggest concerns is that if the MAC report were translated into government policy, it would cut off the ability to secure lower skilled migration into the UK. And in a tight labour market, it would be very difficult to fill vacancies. So I think that's probably the toughest concern longer term that retailers have. Of course, things like automation will continue to filter through, AI as well. There is very much a changing experience on the high street, a movement towards online sales. But we're still going to need people involved in front of shop functions, and particularly in the logistics and distribution chains. And we see that being the biggest threat really from a no-deal Brexit for the long term.
What about the concerns that EU nationals that are employed within the sector you represent? Are you having concerns expressed by them? What are the issues for those who are currently employed, so not ones who've left and decided to move elsewhere, those who are currently employed and would like to carry on working in whatever job they do?
Well, clearly settled status hasn't been fully rolled out, and of course that's a step that around 3.5 million people are going to have to go through. I think there's been some confusion with a statement from the Immigration Minister this afternoon that potentially people might have to prove their right to work in the UK. That would be a big imposition for employers if that had to happen before day one on exit day. So I think it's the sense that EEA nationals who are very valued by employers need to get simple, straightforward guidance, and ensure that the registration process works as smoothly as possible. Because when your status isn't sure, it's a concern over your head the whole time.
Yeah.
And it clearly has an impact on productivity, etc. at work.
Okay, thank you. Who wants to go next? Sonali?
From a people perspective, 1 in 5 of our smaller business employers have at least one member of EU staff. So I'd very much echo William's points around welcoming the government's commitment to sort of respect the rights of EU
Has there been that
nationals.
commitment?
Well, we've interpreted what the Prime Minister has said as sort of providing that.
Yeah, sure.
But I would also add to that, though, that there has been no technical notice on how the settled status scheme would operate in a no-deal scenario. So we're very much hopeful that reassurance can be provided, even more so than has already been provided, as quickly as possible, because so many EU workers are employed by smaller businesses, and of course not forgetting those EU nationals that are self-employed. I think it's a moral as much as a business decision, and I know that many of our smaller businesses want to be able to provide that security to their workers. I think also in terms of more broadly trade, in the event of a no-deal scenario, sort of looking longer term, medium term, longer term, how are smaller businesses, not only those that are currently exporting but also potential exporters, how are they going to really be supported in taking advantage of future trading opportunities when trade may not be as easy as it currently is, both with the EU but also with all those countries that we are currently party to free trade agreements with, or preferential trade agreements with, or even just mutual recognition agreements. How is that going to be compensated for? And of course, how are our smaller businesses going to be supported in trading with wider markets across the globe? They will need particular help and support. It won't just sort of automatically happen. So what is the government's sort of strategy for supporting smaller businesses in that space?
Thank you. Tim?
Yes, I haven't said very much about people so far, but I certainly associate myself with the comments everybody has made. I mean, we employ about 400,000 people nationally, about 30% of whom are EU immigrants. Even before the referendum, we were facing a demographic problem, which was we had an ageing workforce, and we thought we would need to fill 140,000 vacancies by 2024 before the referendum. So we are facing some very serious problems about shortage of people, and the 30% figure hides some quite high spikes in bits of food and drink manufacturing. So if you look at the meat trade, for example, there are massive numbers of migrant workers working in meat processing. So people will be a big thing, and that's an area where I think government can do more to incentivise business to invest behind automation, to see it as a long-term investment, perhaps to reward investment or provide tax breaks for those kind of investments to encourage that to happen more quickly. On trade, the reason why a lot of our trade is with the EU is because food has short shelf life and perishable, and therefore you tend to trade with the nearest market. Yeah. So realigning our trade to more distant markets isn't just a simple proposition that you can kind of switch overnight to a different boat. There will of course be opportunities for import substitution if some of the food that we currently import is no longer available or not at the price that consumers will pay for it. So domestic producers may have opportunities as a result of that. And then maybe the biggest and most difficult issue is, consumers here are used to very high standards of food safety and quality, and have access to a very wide range of nutritious food at all price points. I mean, particularly in London, I think, and if we open ourselves up to trade from other countries that have a different approach to those issues, there will be trade-offs. Yes. And we'll have to make some decisions about whether we think potentially cheaper food is something that we would rather have, or whether actually we're rather attached to the standards of quality and safety that we've had for many years now.
And that's some of the challenges, isn't there, that have been in the news about the US and some of their standards and so on. Could I just move on to ask you about European funding? Because many firms access European funding to support employment and skills training. And I know the government has promised to replace this with a shared prosperity fund. Are you reassured that this fund will continue post-2020 and that you have confidence that your the people you represent will be able to access that training fund going forward into the longer term?
I don't cover employment policy, I'm afraid, so I can't give you a very good answer to that question.
Okay.
We're very keen to input into what we understand will be an upcoming consultation on the shape of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. We welcome the commitments that have been given in the technical notices recently about sort of, you know, continuing on with the current funding until the end of the EU funding round term in the eventuality of a no-deal scenario, so that sort of enables bids to continue to be awarded. Which is really important, not just for those of our smaller businesses that directly receive that money, but also for the wider support that funding gives, which indirectly benefits a lot of smaller businesses and indeed wider communities. Going forward, we think the UK Shared Prosperity Fund is going to be incredibly important in terms of supporting the wider business support landscape, which is arguably going to become even more of a priority for smaller businesses as we face the challenges and opportunities of Brexit. So very keen that the needs of the whole of the UK, including of course the devolved nations, are carefully considered in the upcoming consultation.
So the BRC has just launched an initiative called Project Apollo, which is used to ensure that companies make the full use of things like the apprenticeship levy. It's a way of making sure that retail can be a career. There can be progression within retail. You can start on the shop floor and end up in management. So we have an excellent qualification that we're working with Leeds Beckett University on. And so if there were some additional support to make up for what's been potentially lost in terms of European funding, we think it going into the apprenticeship levy would be a very good idea.
Thank you.
Thank you. I suppose, look, we're talking about a no-deal scenario, but most scenarios here are going to generate a degree of pain and challenges for many of your businesses you represent. In terms of mitigation of it, how key is clarity of information from government about different scenarios or circumstances to minimise the pain? It's almost how much morphine are you going to take, whatever the equivalent is of supporting business, because I can't, you know, from this conversation, think about what would mitigate some of the risks and challenges under a no deal. So, what, you know, apart from clarity of information, what else would you be asking government or those in power to say, right, actually, in the next couple of weeks, I need you to do this, because that's where you were heading, Sonali, in one of your earlier answers around that. What are the asks?
So I think in terms of, I mean, as you say, there are a range of scenarios out there, and the first step is to sort of outline them in easy to understand language. In terms of end state scenarios, clearly the most extreme of those, I think, is a no deal scenario with no transition period. Of course, there can be other variations of no deal that are not quite as extreme as that particular scenario. Then, of course, you've got the Chequers Agreement, you've got EA, you've got the EFTA, you've got the FTA model, you know, the Canada plus plus plus. There are a range of eventual end state options out there, and through our Brexit hub we make an attempt to sort of outline what they will mean in terms of trade, in terms of movement of people, in terms of sort of business travel, short-term business continuity, in terms of data exchange, to start to educate and orientate our members on the spectrum of possibilities that there are. I think right now our smaller businesses, though, really do need that standstill transition period where trade and access to people, EU labour, can continue on pretty much the same terms as currently exists, to give them the time to be able to prepare for a different end state system. So, for example, if we take the issue of people, you know, we have some concerns around the max proposals. We're looking at potentially salary thresholds being introduced and immigration surcharges are being applied to EU labour coming into the UK. we think that could have quite a disproportionate impact on smaller businesses. That's not to say that we don't understand the argument that there are productivity gains out there if there's greater adoption of mechanisation, of automation. But the fact is that it's a journey for smaller businesses to go through. Our recent research has shown that even the adoption of relatively basic digital technologies, still has a long way to go. So we are really keen to make sure that whatever the end state scenario is, there's just no particular cliff edge that's attached, and that there is enough time to allow smaller businesses in particular to be able to prepare for whatever that end state is going to be, whether that's in relation to their trading arrangements, whether that's in relation to how they access skills and labour. The industrial strategy is a really good starting point, but it will take many years for example, T-levels and technical education reform to be able to provide the skills, particularly in that kind of mid-skilled area that I think the MAC kind of nodded to as being very important. Those are long-term endeavours. How are we going to deal with a shorter to medium-term scenario where smaller businesses right now say that the second biggest barrier to their growth aspirations is actually being able to access people with the right kinds of skills?
Okay.
I think if there is a deal in November or December, I think what the government's got to do is, or maybe even January, who knows, I think what the government's got to do is explain exactly what a standstill transition means. Now, it's something that we're all familiar with in the policy community, but particularly I think some of the smaller businesses might not quite understand it means that nothing changes in terms of hiring people, the customs procedures, regulations as far as foods and other products are concerned. And I think getting that message out that a standstill transition means nothing changes is really important. There are some parts, however, even of a standstill transition, which are still of concern. So, for example, many of our members import products using the FTAs, the other trade agreements that the UK is party to. We saw a figure yesterday that only 14 of these agreements were in a position to be transitioned over, which is a very low number. And one thinks of things like Turkey as a very important source of clothing and textiles. Bangladesh and India via the GSP. We've also got significant quantities of wines and fruits coming from South Africa, Peru, Chile. And there is quite a sizable proportion of retailers' imports which come in via this route. And I think it is a concern for us, and I think for Tim even more so on the export side, that these agreements are not fully in a place to be put into complete operation on the 30th of March. So the other thing we need from the Commission and from the UK is to ensure that if there is a deal, that these side deals with third countries are also fixed up very, very quickly and in plenty time for the end of March.
There's almost got to be a real step change once we get to a clearer position, whether it's a parliamentary vote when, and the dragging out, if that's the case, even if it achieves the deal, is good, but also bad in terms of giving us time to do what we need to do. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely, Mr. Duval.
Okay.
I mean, every second wasted is investment that's forgone by retailers.
Tim, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, it's enormously frustrating and disappointing that we're still talking about the withdrawal agreement when we could have been focusing on trying to design a great future trading relationship between the UK and the EU, that would enable all of our members to grow and prosper and for London to grow and prosper too. So that's very disappointing. The MAC report, I think, in many respects has been disappointing. Their decision to equate skill levels with salary levels. In food and drink manufacturing, there are lots of things that we regard as skilled, like fish filleting, that are not technically regarded as skilled occupations, and we see that as a real threat to an already challenged labour market in our sector. We talked briefly about Ireland. One of the reasons why, one of the many reasons why the Irish border is a difficult issue is the absolutely seamless trade in agri-food across that border, and we need to start finding some really imaginative solutions to that which can preserve the seamless nature of it. And, you know, as the spotlight has been turned on the different models that, you know, were just mentioned, whether it's Canada or whether it's Turkey or whether it's EFTA or EA, agriculture and food are always the hardest bit of the trade deal to do, which is why they're not involved. You know, Turkey is not, there's no agri-food element to Turkey. A lot of agri-food is excluded from CETA. And it's going to take time to work that through. Rules of origin, which are critical for food and drink exporters, which I remind you generates £22 billion every year for the economy. You know, rules of origin are critical to get right and incredibly complex, and we should be starting to think about that now. So, you know, definitely opportunities to be had, but frustrating that we're still focusing on the backward-looking part of this.
Now, the Mayor has his own political position, but in terms of some of the way that he's used his platform of the mayoralty to argue for business, is that something you recognise, or is that something that have I got my romantic beer goggles on around that? Because I've spoken to other forms of business and they've said he's been a great champion for us and pushed us into the rooms with government so they can hear some of our problems. What's your perspective of that in terms of the Mayor? What would you want the Mayor to do at this next crucial phase? He's just been to Europe. We took evidence from him around that. Do you think he has an important role here of speaking up for Londoners? I know you work in a national thing. You know, we're governed by boundaries in some ways, but in terms of that platform, do you think he should continue to use that to promote business in a way and promote some of the challenges that you're going to face over the coming months, if not years?
Well, very clearly, the Mayor's been a very strong voice for London business in the last few months, and indeed since the Brexit referendum. I mean, we particularly welcome the focus on the impact on people, that London is a welcoming city. It's also a growing city, which is, you know, with many more consumers buying more and more food and furniture and the kind of items that our members want to sell. I think the key issue is to have as many of our key players in politics engaged with the realities about what this means for people. This is about the uncertainty of an employer being able to hire the person who is the best qualified for the job, whom they want to hire, being prevented to do so by the nature of the final deal we negotiate or the absence of any final deal there at all. This is about businesses wanting to import the best products at the best value for consumers, not being able to do it because we don't have a customs system that really works for the modern economy. It's about making sure that, you know, on things like VAT and excise, that companies don't face nasty hidden traps of extra spending, that consumers don't face extra tax as well. So, yep, the Mayor's been a great champion for that, and we need many more like that throughout the United Kingdom, doing what's right for retailers and consumers.
Continue on.
Yeah, I think, you know, very much welcome, you know, engagement. Our London small businesses in particular, having the opportunity to sort of be able to express their particular concerns and their particular top issues, and having their voices heard, I think has been happening, and more of it is always welcome.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with what both my friends here have said. I think having a strong voice for London is very important. I think not only because of the economic power of London, but, you know, as William's referenced, the cultural power of the voice here is also very important. And, you know, that sense of leadership from every level of government is something that we need to see.
Well, thank you for that. Is there anything else you want to say to us as a committee? I mean, what we're going to do is we take the transcript away, we look at what you have said to us, we look at our previous evidence in our previous sessions, and then we usually write to the Mayor, but on this occasion we're going to be writing to government, I think, because we think more and more of those people there need to understand what we think, as in the evidence that you've presented to us. And I must say, I'm very grateful for the way that you've answered the questions today. And you've given, there's a number of points we need to reflect on, because we've never heard it said in that way of the stark reality in terms of what your members are dealing with, or indeed your sectors are dealing with. So is there anything else you want to say to us?
Only I think that we're grateful for you taking an interest in this, and it gives us another opportunity to air the arguments and to explain, we hope in a very calm and careful way, the important issues that are at stake here.
And I think they are, and they're crucial not just for individual prosperity, but for communities and our nation's prosperity to get this right, to be honest. So we don't work with the different executives of the devolved assemblies, but we do work with the other scrutineers, and we obviously will be sharing some of our work and some of the information you've given us to those scrutineers as well, so they can talk to their executive as well. So we'll be doing that, and we do that with much that Northern Ireland is not sitting at the moment, but the information will be shared with their civil servants, and we certainly talk to the Scottish and Welsh Assembly scrutineers. But thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
Can I ask my members to note the report and the discussion? And then let's just move on for the formal business. Date of the next meeting will be the 28th of November at 2 p.m. in Committee Room 2 in City Hall. There being any other business, I declare this meeting closed.
GLA Chamber Sound.